There was this golden period of indie game development around 2017 to 2020, I would say, where you could walk to a games publisher with your game design document or maybe with a simple prototype and pitch it to them, and you would get a big bag of money and a whole bunch of other stuff. And this was the indie dream for a long time. However, recently the industry environment has changed a lot, and even established studios with previous completed projects that had success are struggling to get signed on by these publishers. So the chances for us, smaller indie developers, have drastically reduced. And the good news is platforms like Steam and such have greatly improved the ability to self-publish your game, which means that you take care of everything. But everything is a lot of stuff. So in this video, I want to talk you through what are the things that a publisher would do for you, because it is a lot more than funding, you guys. Like, it's not just money. They do a lot of extra stuff. And what are like some pieces of advice that I have to try and work around it if you do not have a publisher helping you to do things like marketing, to do things like getting that funding and things like that. And the first thing actually is validation. Don't worry, I'll talk about the money because I know that's what you're interested in, but validation is actually more important in my opinion when it comes to a publisher, because a publisher signing your game means that your game makes sense. And that is something that can sometimes be a bit weird for us indie developers to understand, like, hey, we're making this game, but are people actually interested in this? Does it make sense to put 1 year, 2 years of development into a game without really validating, is this game gonna work? And sure, you can do some playtests, you can give your prototype to some people, but what a publisher really does is, well, they're going to be putting money behind the idea. So if they validate your game, chances are you're probably already on the right track. It's not a guarantee that your game's gonna be perfect, but if you already managed to convince someone to pay $100,000+, for example, for your game, well, probably you'll be able to convince a regular consumer to pay $10, $20 to buy your game as well. This is basically where the topic of market research comes in. And once again, we are no experts on it yet, but I have learned a lot from having failed market research before and having accidentally succeeded market research as well. I've had a weird ride. There are certain things that you can do still to look at to see, hey, does this game make sense? And the very common one, of course, is finding games in a similar genre to yours and seeing how are they selling. Because let's say you want to make your dream game and it's a Toho-style bullet hell game. Okay, all good and well, but then you look at, okay, which games are actually being released nowadays that are not like rebrands of the old school ones, and how many reviews are they getting? And then based on the reviews, you can calculate how much money are they earning, and then you compare that to any other genre, basically. And look, I know you guys, you want to do this for fun as well. My point is not to be here like, hey, this game is not going to make any money, so it doesn't make sense to do it. If you want to make the Toho style game for fun and you're not expecting to get riches out of it, that's fine. If you're going to a publisher, you generally are expecting to get a return on investment. You like put $100,000 in and the publisher wants to get $150,000 out of it. That's how it works. So you want to have success, I guess, if you're watching this video basically. So then it does make sense to consider, hey, maybe this genre isn't gonna work. Maybe I have to shift to a survivor-like. Maybe I'm gonna have to shift to something else. This is one where look at the games that have released up to 3 years ago at most. Don't go for older games. Don't be like, hey, Hollow Knight and Celeste made $1 billion, so let me now make a platformer as well, because I'll also make $1 billion. Look at games that have released in the last 2 to 3 years. A great site for this is Gamealytic, where you can see what genres, median earnings per genre, what is the general revenue and things like wishlists from games that maybe still have to be released. So that's first look. Like, you cannot validate as well as with a publisher giving you money, but you can still spend some more market research looking at what are the games that you want. Crisostomo also says this often of like, hey, Steam currently wants crafty buildy games, like things like Manor Lords, for example, a lot of the stuff that Playway does as well as like a publisher, just looking at the kinds of games they make. It may not be what you, the developer, want, but it is what Steam wants, so keep that in mind. I'm not telling you to just make Playway kind of clones, basically, but it is something that, hey, once again, if you're going into this with the idea of, hey, I want to make money, because you have to recoup, so to say, your imaginary publisher, you do need to take these things into account. If you just want to make this game as a fun side project, then this doesn't matter. Okay, now you've got that great game idea, perfect, but now how am I going to get the money to actually make this a reality? Because the funding is still probably one of the biggest things that a publisher will give to you. And there's no easy alternative. Like, we've made a tier list as well talking about different ways of funding. You can take a look at that over there. But in short, publishers are pretty decent. Now, depending on where you are in the world and like things like what engine you use, grants could be a thing. I know Unreal has an Epic Mega Grant, although they have started to tone down a little bit this year because Epic hasn't been doing so good, so they're not just willy-nilly handing out money anymore. But it could be something to look into. Things like government grants as well, depending on where you live. You can actually apply for game grants. I think the UK has some, Australia has some. The Belgian games industry is being kept afloat basically because of government grants. So depending on where you are, you may be lucky, you may be unlucky. Also, you could try, but those are generally smaller, like general government grants for like starting your business. Those in Belgium, I think we have like, depending on your town, some up to like 5,000 euros. It's nothing crazy, but it is going to help. And yeah, it's a lot of paperwork. But at the end of the day, even if you spend like a week worth on paperwork and you get 6 months worth of development costs like paid out in government grants, you should be good. Now, government grants, sometimes you need to pay them back, sometimes it's just literally free money. Once again, depends on your country, but this is generally your best approach. Then another approach that unfortunately is probably gonna be the most realistic for you, our average viewer, maybe you're not that, but hear me out, is just to make your game whilst combining it with a full-time job. I know it can like kind of suck because we all have this fantasized version of, oh, I want to be a full-time game developer and that's all I do, just make games and make money. It's a bit romanticized. I will never sell you the game dev dream, basically, is what it comes down to, because it is not going to be much easier than combining game development as a hobby or as like a side project with a full-time job. If you really are like, hey, no, I want to go full-time, I've got some stuff saved up, the only piece of advice I can give you here is calculate for your first games to fail and calculate at least 2 years of runway, basically, where you can earn absolutely nothing and still be able to develop on your game. If you can't do that, well, then don't go into full-time game development of like, hey, I'm just going to go and my first game will be a hit. That's not going to work. I think generally it is going to slow down your development, but generally by combining a regular job and game development, you will not have as many sleepless nights as I have been having. Another thing that I quickly want to dispel as well in terms of funding is people are like, hey, I want to get crowdfunding because that's an easy way to get money, right? I'll bash out a quick prototype in like 1 to 2 months. I'm gonna make a Kickstarter page. I'm gonna get $1 million like Stormgate has done. And I have bad news for you. Kickstarter, once again, similar to how there was a golden era for indie publishing, there was also a golden era for Kickstarter, which was like 2014 to 2017. People have gotten a lot more scared, basically, of putting their money in Kickstarters. And even then, there's a lot of people, even here on YouTube, who have that YouTube audience, which is free marketing, basically. Because you need to remember, Kickstarter needs you to do a lot of marketing. That ended up with, honestly, grand scheme of things, not that much money. Talking about $20,000, $30,000 for things like Nightstones, Spilled, and things like that. And that is before all of the costs like advertising, like the cut that Kickstarter takes, and much more. Now, if you are interested in Kickstarters, this is not going to be the video about it, but I've linked a video down below. It's on our Patreon, but it's completely free, talking about me breaking down 2 big Kickstarters. What are my considerations if you do want to make a Kickstarter? And generally, keep in mind, it's not going to be as easy as like, oh, I just make a shitty looking game back in 2014, I got $1 million. That's not how it works anymore, but there is still some good information in it. So if you are interested in that, be sure to head down below. Also, whilst you're there, I quickly want to plug our Patreon as well. If you like this kind of content and you actually want to pitch to publishers, or you're looking for some more in-depth content about game development, on our Patreon we upload 5 extra in-depth videos every month talking about both the financials of running a studio and just more in-depth findings of, hey, how do you actually go to these publishers? I've recently made a video as well about, hey, if you do want to go to publishers, because we do still want to try it, what are some pieces of advice that I've gotten talking to publishers and things like that. There's a crazy amount of value on there, so I suggest if you are wanting to take that step a little bit further and not just make games purely for fun, it is going to be worth it for you to go ahead and subscribe there. So once again, link is down below. So the next step then is, okay, we've gotten money somehow. Maybe you just had rich parents and got a small loan of $1 million. Maybe you robbed the bank. Maybe you got a Kickstarter campaign up and running. Whatever it is, perfect. You can actually make the game. Now, what are we going to do to market the game? Because this is another one where I see a lot of game developers and they're like, okay, I want to make games. I do not want to market my game. I'm just going to get a publisher and the publisher is going to deal with the marketing for you. I understand the approach because marketing is really hard. But I don't think you actually need a publisher for marketing anymore. And sure, you may be like, oh, but that's a lot of extra work. But I firmly believe that there's only one thing really that you need to do to market your game. It's not doing Reddit ads, it's not getting your trailer showcased in like Summer Games Fest or another kind of like big show. It's not getting an article written about your game in IGN, it's not going to Gamescom with a giant booth, and it's not even doing things like Next Fest. I think pretty much all marketing, or 90% of marketing, can come down to just getting creators, people who are streamers, people who are YouTubers, anyone basically who plays video games on any platform, YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, whatever, Kick if you're making a really offensive game, getting them to play your game in front of their audience. Honestly, out of all the marketing things you can do, this is going to be the highest return on ad spend, because often you don't even need to pay them. If you have a cool enough game, which you guys are always very convinced that your games are perfect and awesome, streamers will often play these games for free. There are, of course, certain ways you can improve whether people will play your game depending on the genres and things like that. Like, hey, co-op games with a lot of replayability are going to be better for streamers than like single-player narrative games. That is something you do need to consider. But if you are making a game that has decent replayability, often just sending out emails to influencers and being like, hey, this is my game, you want to play it, is worth it. Once again, I made a full video breaking down step by step how do you find these influencers, how do you contact them, and all of that. Video is linked over there, but it is probably the best approach in my opinion to get a lot of wishlist. It's something where we tried a lot with Forge Industries marketing as well. We did devlogs, we did going to conferences, we did Steam Next Fest, and Steam Next Fest was alright for us, but it still paled in comparison to just getting a few influencers who weren't even big play a game that was completely broken at the end of the day, and this still gave us more wishlists and purchases. Getting like one big influencer to cover your game is all you need basically to start with your marketing, because also content creators are a little bit of a cesspool. We just watch it what everyone else is doing and then it like trickles down. So keep that in mind as well. Once you have one bigger guy playing your game, you're fine. So like I said, even with a broken ass game, we still got a lot of wishlists from influencers playing our game. But ideally, you don't want to have that broken game. And this is another thing where publishers can help you with, and that is QA, quality assurance, where they often have contacts and like special deals with certain firms that are specialized in testing out your game, breaking things, making sure everything works on the different platforms, on different resolutions. They can't just actually get stuck in the game, the tutorials make sense, things like that. This is something, once again, that you could probably do yourself. It just takes a little bit of more time investment. And the first biggest piece of advice I give you here, and that I suggest you do as early as possible once you have something playable, is doing things like going to game dev meetups. They are everywhere, honestly. Unless you are on a mountain in like Nepal, you can probably find a game development group relatively close to you that gets together like at least once every month, every few months, worst case, to get together with. Here in Belgium, it's too easy, so I will keep that in mind. But I think even in other countries, even in the US, even in the UK, there are a lot of very small game dev meetups where it's like, hey, even if it's just 10, 15 people, you just want someone else to play your game already. Now, this is just more feedback. This is not QA, this is not quality assurance per se. It is going to help you though, because you can actually look over their shoulder basically and see what they're doing. And it's going to give you as a developer some ideas of what are they doing? This sounds so dumb, but it makes sense what they're doing maybe in their mind, so you can adjust your game for that. Other things for QA, this is the one instance where I would consider doing devlogs. I am generally not a fan of devlogs, especially not for marketing, but I think it could be a good approach because these events and meetups and whatever, they're not really a calm environment. But if you have something like a devlog and you can then funnel people to a Steam playtest, that is the optimal approach in my opinion to getting more people to play the game calmly. Now, this is where, okay, maybe you need some community building to get those people to actually play the game. But once again, this is something that you can probably try with your marketing campaigns where, hey, instead of advertising the demo immediately, you can advertise a playtest already, things like that. Also, platforms like itch.io, you can put your game on there and see if like people give you feedback. There are multiple ways. And sure, it will not be as professional as a full-time like QA solution or whatever, but it is still going to be enough to catch a lot of the bigger problems. And then one more optional one that publishers sometimes try to push upon you, but that you don't always need to do, is localization. So you generally start developing a game in English first, but depending on things like the genre, certain languages might make sense. Like if you're making a visual novel, you localize it to Chinese. If you're making an RPG, you probably want Japanese as one of your languages. Certain genres do better in certain languages and like certain demographics. So localization can be something that, once again, it costs money. Publishers have experience with how do I do the localization, because localization also requires more QA to make sure that your UI and things like that make sense. It is something that is gonna be harder to do. Now, I've talked about this before and I actually got another video for you. I know, I've got a lot of videos where I sat down with an actual localization company and I talked about, hey, I'm a broke indie, how do I deal with localization the best way and like what are the things to keep in mind? The gist of that video basically is localize your Steam pages using something like ChatGPT. That's fine. Don't worry about the game itself, but just localize the Steam pages and then look at the stats in terms of wish lists and things like that to see where are people from. What languages make sense? If you have no wish lists from China, well, it probably doesn't make as much sense to localize to Chinese. Whereas if, hey, 50% of your wish lists are from China, or in our case, like I think 30% of our wish lists were from Japan, then it makes sense to localize to Japanese. But I think generally, especially if it's your first game, don't focus too much on the localization. We started with the idea of, hey, Forge Industry needs to be localized in 17 different languages because that's what you're supposed to do, right? But the return on investment isn't always there. For certain languages, maybe, but if you are just making your first game, you can stick to plain English if it's a relatively common genre, like certain games like strategy games, once again, and automation games and point and click games for some reason need to be localized to German because Germany is a giant audience there. But if you're making a more general game like an FPS or something like that, you can get around with just English. Once again, this is something that you can't predict on like day one when you write the game design document of, hey, I'm gonna have these 17 languages, including Russian, Chinese and everything. But it is something to take a look at more later on in development. I do suggest if you can and your engine has like support for some localization tools to write your code assuming you can localize the game down the line, but just have only one language basically, which is English. That's gonna make your life much easier than having to tear up your code like 9 months into development to add the localization system on top of it. And then a final thing that I just added, so I'm not gonna go into depth too much about this, is porting and validation. And what I mean by this is back in the olden days, you weren't really able as an individual, like smaller company, to port your game to things like Sony's PlayStation or to the Xbox or anything Nintendo basically up until the Wii U, unless you had those publisher contacts. Now, this has changed a lot and self-publishing on these platforms has become a lot easier. For Nintendo Switch, all you need to have is a trailer and then like fill in a big form and generally you'll get accepted. Xbox, you just need to buy a console, pay 20 bucks and that's it. And then also Sony has made it a lot easier and a lot more friendly to become an indie developer for their platform. So that is not the hard part. Depending on your engine, you can basically immediately export to something like Xbox and whatever. The bigger problem here, and why I wouldn't suggest for your first games to immediately be on all of these platforms at the same time, is validation. This is the part where QA engineers at Sony, at Microsoft and at Nintendo will look at your game and they are extremely strict. Like the different kinds of fonts you use needs to conform with their own guidelines and things like that. And it can be a pretty big time sink to get all of those things right. It's a lot of extra hassle with all of the platforms. I think Nintendo only allows you to release on like Tuesdays and Thursdays or something. It's a lot more complex than only on Steam. So I would suggest, if you do want to consider porting at a later date, just make sure that there's controller support baked into your game. You can also then have the Steam Deck support, which is always a nice to have. And then once again, after release, if your game is a massive success, you can look into, hey, is this worth the extra investment to do the porting, for example? And that is my overall general guide to self-publishing. I think these are the main things when I talk to publishers and also what we're looking for. That's they offer. Now, the goal of this was not to be like, hey, publishers good or bad. There are definitely still a lot of extra things to consider with publishers. Actually, on our Patreon, we have a video as well talking more about publishers. We break down one of their contracts because not all publishers are created equal. Let me tell you that. But I think, once again, this is a good start. If you just want to make your own game and just self-publish it, this should give you enough of a guide to really get quite far already. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I read all of them and I will respond to as many as I can because I am here to help you guys as well, because I just want to be the guy that I didn't have when I started my game development career. So if that's something that you're interested in, we upload 2 videos every week talking to other people in the industry, and I think there's a lot of value on this channel. Subscribing is free at the end of the day, so it would really mean a lot to me if you could subscribe, because honestly, I'm a very superficial person and my happiness is tied to like how fast the number goes up in terms of subscriptions. So if you want to do me a favor, that would be really nice. Anyways, that's all I need to say. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!